America's relationship with Iran has long been one of the most complex and combustible challenges in foreign policy, a puzzle with, honestly, no easy solution. Today, in the summer of 2025, that puzzle is more bewildering than ever. The Trump administration's approach to Tehran is a study in contradictions, blending bellicose rhetoric and military force with surprising economic leniency. This creates a policy that appears to be pulling in two opposite directions at once. On one hand, the administration projects an image of uncompromising strength, vowing to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions and curb its malign influence. On the other, it makes pragmatic concessions that seem to undercut its own stated goals, leaving allies and adversaries alike struggling to understand the endgame. The central tension lies in the administration's simultaneous use of military strikes and economic accommodation. Earlier this year, the world watched as U.S. forces targeted Iran's key nuclear facilities, an act of overt aggression meant to send an unequivocal message. Yet in a stunning reversal, President Trump has now signaled that China, Iran's largest oil customer, can continue its purchases. This decision effectively provides a financial lifeline to the very regime the United States claims to be containing. It is this core contradiction, punishing Iran with one hand while enabling it with the other, that defines the current moment and fuels a fierce debate over whether this is a shrewd strategy or a dangerous improvisation. This policy schizophrenia raises fundamental questions about American objectives in the Middle East. Is the primary goal to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran at all costs, even if it means temporary alliances of convenience? Or is it to weaken the Islamic Republic's grip on power and roll back its regional influence? The administration's actions provide no clear answer, suggesting that perhaps the strategy is less about a long-term vision and more about short-term crisis management. The result is a landscape of uncertainty where tough talk is not always matched by equally tough action, and the path forward remains shrouded in ambiguity. For observers both at home and abroad, this creates a frustrating dynamic. Allies who have been pressured to sever their own economic ties with Iran now watch as the U.S. appears to look the other way on massive oil sales to China. Critics argue that this approach fails to address the root of the problem, a regime that uses its resources to fund terrorism and destabilize its neighbors. As we unpack the different layers of this policy, from oil sanctions to military strikes, it becomes clear that the United States is navigating the Iran issue not with a detailed map, but with a patchwork of tactical decisions that may only postpone a larger reckoning. The cornerstone of President Trump's first-term Iran policy was a campaign of maximum pressure. The logic was simple and direct. By crippling Iran's economy primarily by driving its oil exports to zero, the United States could force the regime to abandon its nuclear program and curtail its support for proxy forces across the Middle East. This policy was revived with vigor in early 2025, as the administration threatened punishing secondary sanctions against any nation that dared to do business with Iran's energy sector. The primary target of this threat was clear China, which had become the Islamic Republic's most crucial economic partner, single-handedly keeping its oil industry afloat through massive, consistent purchases. This hardline stance seemed to reach its peak just a few months ago. Following a stall in nuclear negotiations, the administration doubled down, warning that countries buying Iranian crude would risk being locked out of the U.S. financial system. The message was intended to be a stark ultimatum, forcing Beijing to choose between its energy relationship with Tehran and its economic relationship with Washington. This aggressive posture was consistent with Trump's broader narrative of confronting adversaries without compromise. It projected an image of a United States willing to use its economic might to isolate and squeeze the Iranian regime into submission, a strategy hailed by hawks as the only way to achieve meaningful change. But then came the pivot. In a dramatic and unexpected reversal in late June, following a tense period of military escalation and a fragile ceasefire between Iran and Israel, President Trump publicly declared that China could continue to purchase Iranian oil. The official justification was a mix of pragmatism and self-congratulation. The administration claimed its actions had successfully kept the vital Strait of Hormuz open, a benefit to China, and that Iran now needed the revenue for reconstruction. This sudden shift from threatening total economic warfare to granting a de facto waiver to Iran's biggest customer left many foreign policy experts stunned. It was a move that seemed to completely contradict the very foundation of the maximum pressure campaign. The implications of this reversal are profound. It signals a move away from the all-or-nothing approach that had defined U.S. policy and toward a more flexible, if unpredictable, stance. While the White House insists that sanctions technically remain in place, the president's public statements have effectively given China a green light to continue its energy trade with Iran without fear of serious repercussions. This decision has been interpreted by markets and analysts not as a subtle diplomatic maneuver, but as a clear retreat from the administration's own red lines. The great reversal on oil sales has reshaped the strategic landscape, transforming a policy of maximum pressure into one of ambiguous accommodation. The dramatic softening of the U.S. stance on Chinese oil purchases from Iran reveals a long-standing weakness in the maximum pressure strategy. It was never as absolute as it sounded. For years, experts have pointed out that despite the tough rhetoric, the enforcement of sanctions has been inconsistent. Iran has managed to sustain a significant portion of its oil exports by using a shadow fleet of tankers that operate outside of conventional tracking systems and by conducting transactions in currencies other than the US dollar. China, in particular, has perfected this art, with its independent teapot refineries eagerly buying up discounted Iranian crude, providing Tehran with a steady stream of income. The truth is that a truly maximum pressure campaign would have required the United States to take a step it has always been hesitant to take, directly sanctioning China's major state-owned financial institutions and energy companies. Such a move would be a high-stakes gamble, risking a full-blown economic conflict with the world's second-largest economy. With already tense trade relations and a fragile global economy, the Trump administration appears unwilling to pull that trigger. Instead, it has engaged in a kind of sanctions shell game, focusing its threats on smaller entities while allowing the core of the China-Iran trade to continue, albeit with more discretion than before. President Trump's recent comments essentially acknowledge this reality. By openly permitting China's oil imports, he is formalizing what was already happening behind the scenes. The policy has shifted from one of attempted prohibition to one of tacit acceptance. This is not a sign of diplomatic finesse, but rather an admission of the limits of American power when confronted with a determined adversary like Iran and an indispensable economic partner like China. The administration has calculated that the political and economic costs of a direct confrontation with Beijing over its dealings with Tehran are simply too high, especially when its immediate goal is to de-escalate military tensions in the region. This is why many analysts now refer to the policy as minimum pressure. It creates the illusion of toughness without incurring the risks of a genuine economic showdown. It allows the president to claim he is being hard on Iran while simultaneously avoiding a major disruption to global energy markets or a diplomatic crisis with China. However, this approach comes at a cost. It undermines the credibility of U.S. sanctions as a tool of statecraft and sends a message to the world that American red lines are negotiable. The sanctions regime, once touted as a powerful weapon, now looks more like a performance, a show of force that carefully avoids a real fight. At the heart of the critique against the Trump administration's Iran policy is a simple, troubling question. Where does the money go? When the United States allows billions of dollars in oil revenue to flow into the coffers of the Islamic Republic, it is making a significant bet. The administration's optimistic narrative suggests that a weakened Iran, battered by military strikes and in need of stability, will prioritize domestic reconstruction. The theory is that the regime will use this financial lifeline to rebuild its shattered infrastructure, placate a restless population, and focus inward. This perspective views the oil money as a pragmatic tool for de-escalation, a way to give Tehran a stake in maintaining peace. However, critics view this assumption as dangerously naive and completely detached from the regime's history. For decades, Iran has been designated by the United States as the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. Its revolutionary ideology is built on exporting its influence and confronting its adversaries, chief among them the United States and Israel. This is not just rhetoric, it is a core component of the regime's identity and survival strategy. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a powerful military and economic force within the country, has a long and well-documented record of funding, training, and arming a network of proxy forces, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen. From this critical perspective, every dollar Iran earns from oil sales is not a brick for a new hospital, but a bullet for a proxy fighter. The oil revenue, estimated to be between $50 and $70 billion annually, is seen as the lifeblood of Iran's destabilizing activities across the region. Critics argue that allowing this money to flow freely is tantamount to funding both sides of the conflict. The United States conducts military strikes to degrade Iran's capabilities while simultaneously allowing it to replenish its treasury and rearm its allies. This creates a vicious cycle where American policy ends up chasing the very problems it helps to sustain. This debate exposes the fundamental flaw in a strategy that separates Iran's nuclear program from its regional behavior. The administration seems to believe it can address the nuclear threat with targeted military action, while using economic incentives to moderate the regime's other activities. But for Iran's hardliners, these issues are deeply intertwined. The nuclear program provides a strategic shield, while the proxy network provides strategic depth. Funding for both comes from the same source. By failing to choke off that source, the administration's policy, in the eyes of its detractors, is not a strategy for peace, but a recipe for perpetual conflict, ensuring that Iran remains both a nuclear threshold state and a regional menace. Before the surprising reversal on oil sanctions, the Trump administration's Iran policy was defined by a show of overwhelming military force. In a series of targeted operations, U.S. forces launched strikes against 3 of Iran's most critical nuclear facilities: the deeply buried enrichment plant at Fordow, the main enrichment complex at Natanz, and the uranium conversion facility at Esfahan. Using a combination of powerful bunker-buster bombs and submarine-launched missiles, the attacks were designed to inflict maximum damage on the nerve centers of Iran's nuclear program. In the aftermath, President Trump declared the mission an unequivocal success, claiming the sites were obliterated and Iran's path to a bomb had been set back by decades. This triumphant narrative was quickly broadcast as proof that decisive action, rather than painstaking diplomacy, was the most effective way to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat. The administration presented the strikes as a clean, surgical solution that had removed the problem without getting bogged down in endless negotiations or the complexities of a ground invasion. By taking out the physical infrastructure, the U.S. had, in this telling, eliminated the immediate danger and re-established American deterrence. The message to Tehran and the world was clear: any attempt to build a nuclear weapon would be met with swift and devastating consequences. However, a closer look reveals a much more ambiguous picture. While the strikes undoubtedly caused significant damage, the claim that they have permanently neutralized Iran's nuclear ambitions is highly questionable. Independent intelligence assessments, including preliminary reports from U.S. agencies, have offered a far more sober analysis. They suggest the attacks likely delayed Iran's program not by decades, but by a matter of months, or perhaps a few years at most. The physical buildings may be destroyed, but the most valuable asset, the scientific knowledge and technical expertise of Iran's nuclear scientists, remains intact. This intellectual capital cannot be destroyed by a bunker-buster bomb. The reality is that Iran has proven its resilience time and again. Its nuclear program has survived sabotage, assassinations, and cyber attacks in the past, only to be rebuilt, often with more advanced technology. The knowledge of how to enrich uranium to near weapons-grade levels, which Iran had already achieved by 2025, is not something that can be unlearned. The strikes may have destroyed the current machinery, but they have not erased the blueprint. Therefore, the military action is better understood not as a permanent solution, but as a temporary setback for Tehran. It has pressed the pause button on Iran's nuclear progress, but it has not and cannot press delete. The military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, while dramatic, fit into a familiar pattern of U.S. and Israeli policy toward Tehran, a strategy of delay. For years, the primary goal has been to push back the timeline, to prevent Iran from reaching the nuclear finish line today, while leaving the long-term problem unresolved. This approach is born of a difficult reality. A comprehensive diplomatic solution, like the original Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA, has proven politically fragile and difficult to sustain. On the other hand, a full-scale invasion aimed at regime change is considered just too risky, and, honestly, pretty unpopular. The strikes therefore represent a middle path, a way to manage the threat without solving it. This strategy of kicking the can down the road is appealing in the short term. It creates the appearance of decisive action and delivers a tangible result: a damaged nuclear program. It allows a president to claim a victory and de-escalate a crisis, pushing the ultimate confrontation off to a future date, possibly for a future administration to handle. However, this approach has a fundamental weakness. It does not change the underlying incentives of the Iranian regime. In fact, it may even strengthen the conviction of hardliners in Tehran that a nuclear deterrent is the only ultimate guarantee of their security against foreign attack. Each attack reinforces the narrative that the West is determined to destroy them, making the bomb seem more, not less, necessary. History provides a clear lesson here. After previous acts of sabotage and pressure, Iran did not abandon its nuclear ambitions. Instead, it accelerated its program, moving enrichment activities to more heavily fortified underground sites and developing more efficient centrifuges. The regime learned from each setback, becoming more adept at concealment and more determined in its pursuit. There is little reason to believe this time will be different. The scientists will regroup, the plans will be redrawn, and the work will resume, likely in secret and with a renewed sense of urgency. The delay bought by the bombs is finite. The cycle of delay is therefore a self-perpetuating one. The US strikes Iran's facilities, setting its program back. Iran rebuilds, often more resiliently. As it gets closer to a potential breakout capability, the pressure for another military intervention grows, and the cycle begins anew. This leaves the United States in a state of permanent crisis management, lurching from one short-term fix to the next without ever addressing the strategic dilemma at the core of the issue. The nuclear can is kicked further down the road, but the road itself is a dead end, leading only to the next inevitable confrontation. When viewed as a whole, the Trump administration's 2025 Iran policy does not resemble a coherent long-term strategy. Instead, it looks more like a patchwork of disparate tactics, stitched together in response to immediate pressures and opportunities. It combines the hard-edged militarism of bombing raids with the soft-pedaled economics of allowing oil sales. It mixes aggressive rhetoric with a clear reluctance to engage in the difficult work of either sustained diplomacy or a full-scale confrontation. This collection of ad hoc measures, a strike here, a concession there, lacks a clear, overarching vision for what the United States ultimately wants to achieve with Iran. The policy appears to be driven by a desire to have it both ways, to project strength without bearing the full costs of a consistent hardline approach. The military strikes on Fordow and Natanz were a tactic to deter Iran and satisfy domestic and allied hawks who demanded action. It was a visible, forceful response that addressed the immediate threat of a nuclear breakout. However, the subsequent decision to permit Chinese oil purchases was a tactic to avoid a different set of problems: a spike in global oil prices, a major economic clash with Beijing, and the risk of a wider regional war that could spiral out of control. Each move solved a problem in the moment, but the moves do not add up to a cohesive plan. This tactical, rather than strategic approach is evident in the administration's disinterest in follow-up. After the strikes, President Trump declared the war's done, signaling a desire to move on rather than engage in the complex diplomatic process that would be required to forge a lasting solution. A true strategy would involve a plan for what comes next, how to leverage the military action into a new, more restrictive nuclear agreement, or how to build a global coalition to enforce a truly crippling sanctions regime. Instead, the policy seems to be a series of disconnected episodes, each with its own beginning and end, but with no connecting narrative arc. Ultimately, this patchwork approach is a high-wire act of crisis management. It is about balancing competing risks on a day-to-day basis. The risk of Iran getting a bomb is balanced against the risk of a war. The risk of appearing weak is balanced against the risk of antagonizing China. While this may be a politically expedient way to navigate a treacherous foreign policy landscape, it is not a strategy for success. It is a formula for maintaining a tense and unstable status quo, one where the underlying problems are never solved but merely managed from one crisis to the next, leaving the entire region in a perpetual state of uncertainty. For the most ardent critics of the Iranian regime, the patchwork of strikes and sanctions will never be enough. They argue that as long as the Islamic Republic exists in its current form, it will remain a threat to regional stability and American interests. From this perspective, the only true, lasting solution is regime change. This view holds that the problem is not Iran's policies but the fundamental nature of the regime itself, its revolutionary ideology, its brutal repression of its own people, and its unwavering commitment to exporting its influence. As long as the mullahs are in power, the argument goes, there can be no real peace, and any agreements made are merely temporary truces. However, the path to regime change is fraught with immense danger and uncertainty, which is precisely why successive U.S. administrations, including Trump's, have shied away from making it an explicit policy goal. The most direct route, a military invasion, is a non-starter for both political and practical reasons. The American public is deeply weary of large-scale conflicts in the Middle East after the long and costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is virtually no political appetite for another ground war, especially against a country as large and formidable as Iran. Such an invasion would likely devolve into a bloody, protracted insurgency, destabilize the entire region, and cause a catastrophic spike in global oil prices. A less direct approach, such as actively fomenting a popular uprising, is also incredibly risky. While Iran has a vibrant and courageous protest movement, as seen in the widespread demonstrations following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022, direct foreign intervention could easily backfire. It would allow the regime to paint any domestic opposition as a tool of the CIA, discrediting genuine grassroots movements and justifying an even more brutal crackdown. Furthermore, there is no guarantee that what comes after the current regime would be any better. The collapse of the state could lead to a chaotic civil war, creating a power vacuum that could be filled by even more radical elements. This is the regime change dilemma. The current government in Tehran is seen by many as an intractable problem, yet the available tools to remove it are either unpalatable or likely to create an even greater catastrophe. This leaves U.S. policymakers trapped between a deeply flawed status quo and a set of terrifying alternatives. It is this dilemma that pushes them toward the middle ground of sanctions and limited military strikes, a policy that, while unsatisfying and incoherent, is seen as the least bad option. It is a tacit acknowledgement that while the U.S. may not like the Iranian regime, it does not have a safe or reliable way to get rid of it. The ultimate outcome of President Trump's current Iran policy is a state of strategic limbo. It is a policy that avoids the toughest decisions and, as a result, fails to produce a definitive resolution. The core issues at the heart of the U.S.-Iran conflict, the nuclear program, the funding of terrorism, the regime's regional ambitions, are not being solved. They are being managed, contained, and postponed. The administration's approach creates a persistent cycle of tension and temporary relief, but it does not alter the fundamental trajectory of the conflict. This leaves the United States, its allies, and the entire Middle East in a precarious and uncertain position. The gap between the administration's tough rhetoric and its pragmatic actions creates a deep sense of frustration. Hawks who desire a more confrontational approach are angered by the economic concessions to China, seeing it as a betrayal of the maximum pressure promise. Doves, who advocate for diplomacy, are dismayed by the military strikes, which they see as needlessly provocative and counterproductive to long-term peace. The policy satisfies no one because it is not designed to achieve a clear, final objective. It is a policy of the moment, designed to navigate today's headlines and challenges without a clear vision for tomorrow. This leaves an unstable and unresolved problem for whoever comes next. The military strikes may have bought some time, but Iran's nuclear knowledge remains. The regime, still flush with oil money, will continue to fund its proxies and pursue its strategic goals. The fundamental conflict of interest between Washington and Tehran will persist. The next administration, whether led by Trump or a successor, will inherit the same set of challenges: a nuclear-capable Iran, a destabilizing regional actor, and a limited set of politically viable options. The patchwork strategy of 2025 ensures that the Iran problem will remain a ticking clock, passed down from one president to the next. In the end, this policy is defined by its limitations. The United States is constrained by a war-weary public, the economic power of China, and the immense risks of a full-scale conflict. Iran, in turn, is constrained by a battered economy and the threat of American military power. The result is a tense stalemate, a state of limbo where neither side can achieve a decisive victory. The current strategy is not a path to a solution, but a way of living with an unsolvable problem. It is a short-term fix that all but guarantees a long-term headache, leaving the most dangerous aspects of the Iran puzzle for another day.